Thank you for coming. My name is Allan, and I'm going to be talking to you about some excessive logging on Android phones. So who remembers contract tracing or exposure notification? I can't see anyway. Okay. Well, the Google and Apple exposure notification framework was intended to be privacy preserving. It was based on a really solid algorithm. However, in its initial implementation, it had a few problems. The advertised privacy of this framework relied on anonymous identifiers remaining secret. However, we found that regardless of the Android device it was running on, the framework would log supposedly anonymous identifiers in the system log, both by the device that generated it as well as every phone that observed it. And exposure status is logged as well. This data probably should not have been in log in the first place. And when this was disclosed to Google, they fixed this specific case. Sensitive information in the log is only a problem if it can be read. Everything in Android is protected by a permission. Some innocuous permissions are just granted upon automatically when an app is installed. Others, more sensitive ones, like with the camera or the microphone, are prompted whenever an app goes to access those devices. But the read logs permission is special because it's this permission which allows apps to read the entire system log and that are of entries that are generated either by the system itself or by any app running on the phone can only be held by privileged pre-installed apps. This allows Google and the device manufacturers to obtain crash reports. However, these privileged apps can potentially leak this information. And as shown a few years ago at Oakland, there's a concerning lack of control over these privileges. There's a vast and complex supply chain of software that gets pre-installed on phones and potentially could have this permission since it's pre-installed, right? This includes software from chip manufacturers, the ODMs, the vendors who make the phones and sell the phones, the app markets, mobile network operators, and resellers, et cetera. It also includes any software from any of the above, including ad tech firms, social media networks, or whoever the phone vendors decide to partner with. Given that, we wanted to explore two questions. First, is it common for sensitive information to end up in the logs? And secondly, who has access to these logs? So, is information in the logs? We decided to examine whether different types of identifiers are ending up in the log files. For our purposes, we took an expansive view of what might be personally identifying information and searched for these different types of identifiers that could be used to identify an individual. In particularly, notice that some of those are protected identifiers in Android that even some apps can't access. So what is ending up in the log files? We examined several new phones and just examined what was identifiers that we could find in the logs given like a new phone. So we noticed that all phones that we looked at logged some things. Some even logged Bluetooth packets and payloads. And the last column lists the number of apps on those particular phones that had the read logs permission. And I have no idea why a phone might need 95 different apps that can read the entire system log. But they'll have to question, although we found PII is in the log of our phones, is that true of phones throughout all the world? So inspecting devices at scale for identifiers is kind of challenging, like purchasing every model and of every variant that's under every mobile network operator in the world was a little infeasible. And so we turned to crowdsourcing to collect data from a variety of devices around the world to measure whether identifiers are broadly found on phones. So we developed a website and accompanying app to analyze the phones of volunteers for the presence of PII in the system logs. At a high level, the volunteer would connect their phone to their computer and running code in their browser, it would analyze their phone to see if any of the identifiers they could determine were on the phone in the logs. And at no time did the raw logs ever leave the volunteers' devices. And after filtering out incomplete reports, we found devices that obviously appeared to be development devices. We just excluded those ones. But out of what we had left, we had 529 different models, variants, and we found that sensitive information being logged is a prevalent problem on just about everywhere. The different types are on different phone models. We were able to look for different identifiers. That's why the prevalence switches so often. Okay, but that left the question, if identifiers are found in the logs of so many phones, like where is this coming from? So we'd observed many log lines that seemed to indicate that it had something being related to the Wi-Fi. So we used a Pixel 3a running standard factory build of Android phone, 12 and examined the log entries generated as the phone was connecting to Wi-Fi. And we found a lot. For those of you who are trying to geolocate my office, I anonymized some of the location data. Okay, since there's an open source version of Android, we searched the available source code to find out what might be generating these particular lines. And it didn't take long to find the same phrase, my own MAC address, in the log entries. And with a bit more digging, we discovered a build time constant in the config file that if it was defined at compile time, would remove all these log entries. So one thing I'd like to point out is standard out, where it says talks about standard out. If you remember the time and the context, like I do, from when these type of daemons were developed, you know where this is coming from. However, modern app developers seem to use Android system logs the same way as we used to use like printf statements, just kind of sprinkle through your code that would just dump stuff to the console. Now, as a comparison, we looked from logs from a Xiaomi Redmi Note 9 and tried to find similar information was logged when it was connecting to Wi-Fi. Although it did seem to be running WPA supplicant, same as the Pixel, I did not find any of the corresponding log lines. So this seems to be one case in which the manufacturer did disable debug logging on their production code. My assumption is that they noticed those switches in the config file and did the right thing. So in examining logs generated by apps on our test phone, we came across this interesting one that had seemed to have device identifiers right in the log entry. You'll notice it looks like an entire URL request string. Now, so where is this coming from? Well, Volley is a library that's used for network configurations, works really good if you're writing an app. And the particular line where that was logging this particular one about the slow request threshold, well, like a lot of developers like me, for example, you'd have looked at this and say, oh, if I set debugging to false, then that library is not going to log anything. But if you kind of look, that's actually an or, not an and. And if you happen to be on a network that is slow, then the log entry is still going to happen. So I thought it might be a bug, followed up with the maintainer, and they said, nope, this is actually working how we intended it to work, even though the behavior is kind of surprising. Well, I thought perhaps it should be a little easier for developers to disable logging and debug messages in their code, especially ones that potentially could leak sensitive information. And so we continued the discussion. And after few more discussions about logging on Android, they accepted a patch. Now, if you're using, with the current version of Volley, if you're using that and you set debug to false, logs don't show up. So we found code in the operating system that logged sensitive data, but how about other things? So we examined a few apps manually and tried to execute them in a more realistic manner. CVS and Shoppers are two prominent pharmacies in North America, and that provide a lot of pharmacy type things. So we found logs tagged on these ones. We found logs tagged as Adobe Experience SDK that detail the user's actions throughout there. This is a sample from the Shoppers Drug Mart version. And this version is highlighted, kind of spread out that JSON object that was packed in the log entry. And I want to point out one log entry from this line. what do you know about the health status of somebody who is buying this formulation of aspirin? Well, this is an over-the-counter medication here that is only prescribed to those with high risk of heart attack or stroke. That's the only reason you take this one. So apparently medical and health information can be in those log files. But why was it logged? Well, the Adobe Experience documentation details how you can set the log level in the logging mode as debug if you want. That's right from the documentation. And by default, however, by default, the logging mode is set to error. So why was it set to debug? Well, if by default, none of those log entries would have been there. But we assume that the developers read this far into the documentation, copied and pasted it in, and their app ran. But even though on the next page, pretty much, it says, don't do this because debug can be performance and security problems. Oh, and in any case, Google says that when you release an app, you should clean up the logging. So are apps able to access the logs? Can anybody read it? Well, we cross-referenced the data from our field study, from the models that we saw there, with a previous work that collected data. And we found that there were a lot of entries, a lot of different apps on each of the phones that could read the logs. And as we've seen before, this read logs restricted permission. It says not for use by third-party applications, but what is a third party in this context? Well, in addition to the device manufacturer, there's a large number of entities with the permission, and we saw these types of apps with, when you cross-reference the data that did have the read logs permission. So who's not on there? Well, basically, you're not on there. Like the user themselves is about the only person that may be considered a third party in this case, it seems. But if you were to look at this from a surveillance capitalism perspective, it kind of makes sense. But that's another talk. So mitigations. As we've seen on this side, as we've seen on this slide before, the compatibility test suite includes checks for presence of potentially sensitive information in the logs. However, either the tests aren't working or the developers, when they get this report back, say, oh, that's in the logs, and they just keep going with it. Either way, it is making it into the production code. Furthermore, apps in the Play Store are not being monitored for excessive logging, even though that was supposedly one of the release conditions, according to Google. So in response to our disclosure and our earlier work, Google introduced a new control in Android 13 with the goal of discouraging entities from collecting log entries as a matter of course. Now, whenever an app running in the foreground requests to read the entire logs, you get this window that pops up each and every time that it asks to read the logs. So this should help uncover apps that routinely try to collect all the logs. So in conclusion, first, the logging is sensitive information is prevalent across all phones, both by the system services, by apps that are either misconfigure the SDKs and libraries that they use, or they're just shipped into debug mode. And note that many pre-installed apps are on pretty much all devices that can read the logs. And we did have a little bit of an impact. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.